Before we start, we want to point out that this is our 100th episode of Tucker Carlson Today, which is kind of amazing. We urge you to watch every one of them, back to back. It'll take you more than 4 days, but we think it's well worth it. Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. Andrew Doyle is a writer, a comedian, the man behind the Titiana McGrath account on Twitter, the author of the new book, Free Speech and Why It Matters. More than anything, one of the smartest, most insightful people currently writing in English. In a just world, he would be world famous. Someday he will be, because no one has called this moment more accurately than Andrew Doyle, and we are honored to have him with us on the set.
Thanks for
Andrew
having
Doyle,
me.
thank you. I literally was brooding about this last night as I was reading your stuff, which I read regularly anyway, but I was immersing myself in it, and I was thinking, in a moment like ours where art has mostly died, nothing creative or interesting, overstatement, but very little just creative or interesting is being created right now, is being made right now. You know, your, just this Twitter account should be enough to, I don't know, win you an Oscar or something.
I mean, if only they did Oscars for Twitter.
No.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, you say it's an overstatement, but there is a problem within the arts generally, within comedy, within theatre, within film, insofar as it has been completely captured by this ideological movement. And that really means that artists suffer, ultimately, because even the ones who are naturally subversive are not going to go out of their way to explore those territories that artists often have done in the past, because if they do, they're not going to get booked, they're not going to get their plays on or their films commissioned or anything else. Or
Yeah, I have contempt for artists who censor themselves. I mean, then you're not an artist at that point.
Well,
right?
exactly. I mean, exactly. I mean, and there are a lot of artists who are not innately controversial, and so their stuff will always have a platform. But for those who are naturally subversive and naturally want to try and tackle some of the more sensitive areas, a lot of them, I'm afraid, are self-censoring. I speak to comedians all the time in the UK who tell me about how, you know, I like what you're doing. I'm not going to say I do publicly, but I like the fact that you're joking about this, and I wish I could do that as well. And I think, well, you know what, you could. And
well,
if,
of course.
And, you know, you do get flack for it. And sure, you're not going to get on the BBC or anything like that. But there are other avenues you can explore. That world is gone. There's all sorts of ways that you can get a platform for your work these days.
That's exactly right.
You know?
So before we get into what you are doing, what you have written, the art that you have made, for our audience, just give us an overview of who you are, where you're from, how you got to today.
Yeah, okay. Well, I grew up in the Midlands in England, and from a Catholic background, went to a convent school. I then went to 3 universities, actually, because I sort of got trapped in it. Not trapped so much because I was enjoying it, but I did an undergraduate degree in English, then a master's degree in English Renaissance literature, and then a doctorate in Renaissance poetry. So I ended up at Oxford doing my doctorate and also being a part-time lecturer there. So at that point, I was going to be an academic, and I was full-on ready to be an academic. Then my supervisor one day said to me, you know, you really mustn't do this with your life. He said, don't do this.
What?
Well, he was an old don at Oxford, you know, and he said to me, you'll end up an 80-year-old man running around the quad screaming, why have I wasted my life? And I sort of took that to heart, because I was spending a lot of time in the old library at Oxford, because my work was on early modern manuscripts. So sort of the sort of old stuff that you had to go into the Duke Humphreys library to look at, this old library. It was the library in the Harry Potter movies.
Yes.
So you recognise it with the books chained down, but that's real, that's in there. And I'd sit in there, no sunlight, there'd be all these academics around me, sort of older people, you know, twitching, and you know, you can see, like, is that my future? Is that what I want? You know, I've got no social life. I'm just immersing myself in books and academic. And I thought, no, I didn't want to do it. So I moved to London, started writing plays, doing stand-up stuff on very fringe venues, you know, like pub venues, little theatres above a pub.
Wait, how do you go from getting a PhD in Renaissance poetry at Oxford to doing stand-up in pubs?
Yeah, well, some would say it's a self-sabotage, right?
Because no, I'm glad you did.
You've got a career trajectory, and it feels like, you know, this is something you want to do. And I got disillusioned with that, and I thought, no, I don't really. And I started doing stand-up. And, you know, stand-up on the London comedy circuit, it's quite rough and ready.
Oh, I can't imagine.
It's sometimes you're performing to just a handful of drunken people who really don't want you to be there. So you do it, and I was doing this in London, and then there was an elderly woman who was watching my plays who said, I really like what you're doing, come and live with me, and you don't have to pay rent or anything, and it's almost like having a patron. So I did that for a while. She was wonderful, and I don't come from money, I didn't have money, so that was a good way for me to do this and develop what I was doing. But in the end, it got to the point where, look, I need a job, I need to do something, and the only thing I was qualified for was teaching, so I became a secondary school teacher, and I did that for about 7 years, and all the while I was doing stand-up and writing while I was doing it. That's not very compatible, actually. Like if you're a school teacher and you're doing stand-up, there's always the risk that maybe the people you're teaching will end up coming to your night.
Well, for sure.
And you know, sometimes they would, you know, Google my act, and of course stand-up comedy is not compatible with teaching at all. Even had complaints to one of the headmistresses saying, why did you employ this person? Some of these jokes are a bit near the knuckle, you know, that kind of thing.
Oh, so that happened?
It did happen, yeah, absolutely. So I ended up, when I earned enough money out of stand-up, I just went into stand-up and I pulled away from the teaching. Because I think you can't do both, ultimately, because I'd be out late at night, and because I was teaching at a boarding school, you know, I'd be up early in the morning getting all the kids up, and it was very full on, and then your work suffers in both arenas. It suffers as a stand-up and it suffers in this classroom.
How hard is it to support yourself as a stand-up in England?
Oh, it's impossible, because you spend about 3 or 4 years on the open mic circuit where you get paid nothing, basically. So you're just developing material. You're losing money because you pay to get to the gigs. You're not making money at the gigs. Eventually you graduate to doing sort of short paid spots. I don't know how it is here. It's probably similar in America. And then you get paid for longer sets. And it's a very gradual process for most people. Some people get snatched overnight. But for most people, you're on the circuit for a few years. And this is why predominantly a lot of stand-ups in the UK come from wealthy families, because they have to, because that's the way you get supported. But if you don't have that, you have to work all day and then work at the night as a stand-up comedian. So, you know, but you know what? It's a vocation, isn't it? And I loved doing it. That's how I ended up doing comedy and writing plays at the same time. And then that it's sort of gone from there, really. But I left teaching a number of years ago now.
Amazing. So this Twitter feed, Tatiana McGrath.
Yeah.
How did you start this and why?
So that came about because that must have been 2018, I think, or roughly then, March 2018. And I suppose I just was getting frustrated with what they call the social justice movement, or what's become known as the woke movement, whatever we want to call it. That it seemed to be impervious to reason, impervious to criticism. You couldn't rationalize with people who had been captured by this worldview. And so therefore, as a comedian, my instinct was, well, I'll mock it. And I wasn't seeing much of that going on. And then I thought maybe a better way to do it would be through satire, in other words, to kind of embody what it is they represent and take it to its logical conclusions, which is bound to be absurd. So then you do that by creating a character who is what I perceive to be the epitome of a social justice activist. And that's how Titania came about. And my friend Lisa created the image for me, a composite of a number of women. I'd found a sort of archetype of what I wanted it to look like. Very po-faced, young, white, privileged, financially privileged, that is, woman. And the po-face is quite important because on Twitter then it provides a kind of deadpan quality to the writing. You know, you're reading these things and she's staring at you and she's looking very disapprovingly at you, you know, and so that's a nice sort of way to do it. And then I just started doing it, and she's also a slam poet. So she writes terrible poetry, which she thinks is a work of genius that's unparalleled since Shakespeare, you know. She's very, very arrogant. But that was the thing I really wanted to capture, is that whenever I engage with these activists online, it's the sheer certainty that it never crosses their mind that they might be wrong. It never crosses their mind that their opponents might just have a different worldview. They just assume everyone else is evil, we're right, everything must change. And that to me is dangerous and scary, but also funny. I mean, the sheer arrogance of that is quite funny, you know.
And the lack of self-awareness.
No self-awareness at all. I mean, you go, their view of humanity is something like this, because, I mean, you've noticed the way they're trying to destroy history. So they will want to topple statues, rename streets, do everything that Orwell wrote about, in fact. And their idea is that up until now, human beings have got it wrong. That we've always been evil and just wrong on every issue. And now they've come along and they are morally pure and they've got all the answers. And they will never be judged in the future by future generations, but of course they will. But they think they've got it all right, so they're going to just sort of dismantle society as it is, start from scratch, let's call it year zero. And that's where they're coming from. And I find that level of arrogance is always funny. And satirists and comedians have always gone after Puritans, always gone, and by Puritans and Pharisees and, you know, these kind of figures. And actually, at least the Puritans had a sense of self-awareness. They believed that they were unworthy before God.
Exactly.
They had a sense of their own fallibility. It was actually quite fundamental to their belief system. So when I use the word Puritans to describe these people, I'm actually not really comparing it to those people. I'm talking about this idea of a new purity culture. And it is a purity culture. They believe that unless you are 100% on board with all of their ideas, you are, damned, effectively. You are on the outside. So to try and capture that in a character, and it had to be Twitter, didn't it? Because that's their battleground.
Of course.
That's where they do it. And when it did emerge that it was me, there was a lot of anger directed towards me because I was accused of, pretending to be a woman. But of course, that's just a writer creating a fictional character. That has been done before. Like, this is not a massive surprise.
Well, I mean, they're angry because you so precisely describe them. Tatiana McGrath, in her Twitter bio, describes herself as, and I'm quoting, activist, healer, radical intersectionalist poet, non-white, she's very white, ecosexual, pronouns variable, selfless and brave, buy my books.
Yeah, she's a hypocrite. She's
What's so
hypocrite.
interesting, and this is why you deserve the credit, all the credit, for capturing this moment more perfectly than anybody. You have on this Twitter feed a list of ludicrous proposals that you've put forward over the years,
yes,
through her mouth, that have come true.
Yeah.
So can I just read a couple of these?
Sure, of course.
So, December 2018, I called for biological sex to be removed from birth certificates. December 17th, 2020, New England Journal of Medicine agrees. October 2019, I suggested that young women should be encouraged to travel alone in Pakistan. 12 days later, Forbes magazine agrees. So your original tweet on that was, white parents, if you really want to prove you're not racist, you should send your teenage daughters on unaccompanied walking holidays in the tribal regions of North Pakistan.
Yeah, and then they wrote an article suggesting just that 2 weeks
Forbes
later.
write, why Pakistan should be on every solo female traveler's bucket list.
It's like they were reading the account and taking ideas.
I mean, it's like...
some of them are, I think, for me, when I wrote the first book as Titania, she did a part about the privilege of Helen Keller, which I thought was just so ridiculous. This white girl, with all her privilege, and then they did it. I can't remember what the publication was, but a publication on that list ended up actually saying exactly that, just 2 years on. So even the most absurd thing you think of...
It's like, it's not even... It's hard to believe it's real.
Yeah.
So, but it's brilliant. How many people thought this was a real Twitter account?
Oh, lots. Particularly when I'd started. So I wasn't openly... It was more fun for me. It was entertaining to myself. And I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't even tell close friends or anything. I just did it for myself. It was fun. I started thinking like her. It's sort of... To get into that mindset is kind of a fascinating thing. And she would always get into arguments with people. There's actually a long thread on the Titania account, which I must pin to the top again because I really enjoy it. It's where she engages in debates with people. And I like to stay in character when I'm doing that. I haven't done that for a while. I need to go back to doing that because it's really interesting. The trouble is now more and more people know that it's not real. So that's the problem. So that can't happen so much. But yeah, you would get people from all sides of the political spectrum angry at her for all sorts of reasons. A lot of the time it was people who probably agree with me about a lot of stuff. But because she's quite close to what they actually say, they naturally would assume it was real and get into arguments with her. I understand that because the stuff that she says isn't a million miles away from what activists actually say. Sometimes it's pretty direct.
What year did you start this?
So it was 2018, early 2018.
Okay, so it's a totally different country.
Yeah.
3.5 years later.
Right, exactly. I mean, things have, and that's why a lot of the things she predicted, I think, have come true because the culture war has completely exploded. And I back then, I remember, I knew this was going to become the dominant thing, and I was often accused of arguing, because I used to write articles about this as well in my own voice, sort of criticising where we're going with all of this stuff. And I was often told, well, you're just talking about a few rogue students who are getting upset on campus, or these are just some activists on the internet, we can just ignore them. But you can't. But what I'm saying is, and I don't want to sound like I'm saying I told you so, but it's like I have been vindicated. Now it is in every major institution, every major political, artistic, cultural institution, the media. It's infected all of the systems of power, which is why you can't just say, oh, it's just a few students we can ignore. It's something more sinister now. And yeah, you're right, the world has changed. Who'd have thought it in about 3 years' time? So radically. It's almost unrecognizable.
It is almost unrecognizable. I want to ask you about that, but first I have to ask how this is so deeply amusing because it is so precise. It's so accurate. How do you understand this mindset so well?
So I think because when I was at university, because I had plans to become an academic, and because so much of my research on Renaissance literature focused around the notions of gender and sexuality. This meant that I was steeped in the writings of Foucault, or the theories of Foucault and people like Derrida and Lyotard, sort of the post-structuralists of the 70s, 60s and 70s. That was sort of compulsory at the time. If you wanted to study English literature, you had to sort of engage with that kind of worldview. The post-structuralist idea that our reality is constructed solely through language, or at least our perception of reality is all about language. And that's why you see the activists of today always going on about how language is dangerous, how words are violence, how jokes normalize hate, because they believe that everything is language, but of course there is a reality beyond language. But that was all very much part of my studies and my interest. So I read a lot of people like Judith Butler of the world, who has a background in literature as well. I read those sorts of people who are kind of the precursors to what we're seeing now. If you look at a lot of what the activists are saying now, it is derived from, it's not the same as, but it is derived from that sort of postmodern thought of the 60s and 70s. So I think I'd read a lot of the background stuff about this. But then also I am fascinated by culture and by the way, by people's ideas. I like to try and take people on good faith and listen to what they've got to say. And I've read a lot of these people's books, a lot of these activists' books, out of interest more than anything. I think it's important to read things you don't agree with.
Yes.
And even in the worst, even like something like Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, which is a terrible book, but every now and then there's a kernel of truth. Every now and then there's something you think, okay, there's something to that.
Well, sure, yeah.
And so it's just useful. And then the more I've done this kind of stuff and talked about the culture war and also written as Titania, the more I've read. There was a period where I was only reading stuff like that, and that can drive you insane. That's not good for anyone's mental health. No, it's not. Because then you start seeing these power structures everywhere, because they are like a kind of the equivalent of the medieval clergy. They see themselves as the elect, right? So they say there are these invisible power structures that dominate absolutely everything, and we are solely qualified to detect these power structures because we have a background in queer theory or critical race theory or whatever else whatever offshoot of postmodernism it might be. And you people, the plebeians, don't have to worry about it. We'll tell you where these structures are. You just take it on faith, and that's pretty much where we are at. And that's why they talk in this pseudo-religious way. They'll talk about the structures of power, the unconscious bias, all of these kinds of things. And when you say, yeah, but where's the evidence for that? Where is it? They'll say there is an institutional problem within this particular university, say. They'll say this university is institutionally racist. And then when you look at the data and it reveals that it's not, they'll say, yes, it is. You just have to accept it. There's a sort of distinction between reality and...
But they don't seem that impressive. I guess I don't even have a problem philosophically with the idea of some sort of priesthood that interprets complexities for the masses. Like, effectively, we've always had something like that. Yeah. This seems like a particularly dumb priesthood. I almost never hear any of these people say something where I think, wow, that person's really smart.
I get completely what you're saying. There's a reason why the church kept the Bible in Latin for so long. They didn't want it in the vernacular.
Right.
They didn't want it, because they then have the access to the sacred text.
Right.
But at least there's something to the Bible, right? At least there's wisdom within that text.
And some of the monks were actually really impressive.
Really impressive theologians.
Erudite people, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and and some of the social justice movement, some of those people are very smart people. They can make these very empty ideas sound very persuasive or sound substantial, just because they use their own jargon and language, and that's why a lot of people don't like to engage with it, because they don't understand it. They hear all these words and these phrases like phallogocentric or discourses of power, hegemony or whatever, and they back off. But these are just tricks. These are just words to try and dress up some very simple and flawed ideas in the accoutrement of respectability, academic respectability. So, I don't think they are great thinkers at all, and that's why it's good to mock it, because if you mock it, you can break through it and you can expose how ludicrous it is.
Exactly. What do they think of you? They must really hate you.
Yeah.
Really hate you.
Yeah. It's weird because I'm not a confrontational person. So once that came out...
And you're not even like some crazy right-winger, are you?
No.
Right.
No,
okay,
exactly.
So it's just interesting. So they really, the only reason they hate you is because you've got their number.
I guess it's that idea that there could be a degree to which they think, or they misinterpret what I'm doing as punching down at minority groups. And they might say, if I mock something such as... I don't know if you have it over here to the extent, we have the LGBT pride flag, which is a rainbow-coloured flag, but they've added lots of extra stripes to cover racial minorities and trans minorities, and the thing looks a mess. Now it's an eyesore. And so I make fun of that flag, and they think I'm being homophobic by making fun of the flag. But I'm making fun of the flag because it's ridiculous. You know, for instance, so I think it started here. I think it started in Philadelphia, where Pride, they added 2 stripes to the rainbow. Bear in mind the rainbow is meant to signify harmony and unity, yeah?
Right.
They added a black stripe and a brown stripe because they said they wanted to represent racial minorities because it wasn't inclusive to racial minorities. Now, the implication of that is that the rainbow flag is a literal representation of the skin colours that are acceptable in the gay community. That's not what it means. You know, that's not what it means at all. So it's this really, it's stupid and funny. But if you mock that, then they'll say, oh, well, I see. So you're having a go at racial minorities, or you're having a go at gay people, or you're having a go at trans people. No, I'm having a go at the ludicrous nature of identity politics and how it makes you look stupid. And actually, the best thing for the gay community to do is to just reject that flag and reject these stupid initialisms. What is it now? LGBTQIA2 double plus or something like this. I think I saw Justin Trudeau recently was stumbling over it. Even he can't get it right.
Right. And that's his whole life of stuff like
this.
That's
it. I think he was trying to say 2S. LLQIA, and you can see him on the footage, like stumbling as I am just now, because it's impossible to get right. And that to me is really hilarious.
I doubt you could define half those categories anyway.
No, exactly. I mean, you know, this proliferation of multiple gender identities and multiple sexualities and all the rest of it. I'm a liberal. I know that means something different over here.
Right.
Where I come from, what liberal means is you believe in liberal values like free speech, freedom of the press, individual autonomy, you know, the right to free association.
Certainly, if that's the definition, I'm very liberal.
Right, yeah, exactly. This is what I suppose you'd call classical liberal in this context. Yeah, I mean, that's where I come from. So those things I don't think are particularly controversial at all. But fundamentally, this movement is an illiberal movement in that respect. And it wants to divide everyone up into their own little box. And I think if you want to invent new identities, new pronouns, whatever, you can call yourself whatever you want. I take this liberal position. Anyone should be able to identify however they want, call themselves whatever they want. All the rest of it, wave your flags. If you need a flag, that's fine. You know, there's a flag for everything. There's a flag for pansexuals, abrosexuals, all allosexuals, all of them. Do that. It doesn't bother me. But it's when you impose it on everyone else that I've got a problem with it. It's when you say, look, I want to use these pronouns that I've invented, je and je, or whatever it might be, and everyone else has to accommodate my particular thing. Well, no, they don't. It's up to them what words they use. Right. You know, that's my view on this. It's, you know, I feel like...
Well, you think people should have a right to determine what words they use?
About themselves. Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's basically it.
Yeah.
That has become a controversial view. Why? Why is that?
Well, it only goes one way, though. It's one group of people demanding that everyone else accommodate them, but the out-group never makes demands on them.
Right. I just think that the obvious solution here is just let everyone say what they want to say, you know.
Well, nobody, clearly. Where does the current, so you've been doing this in this Twitter feed for 3.5 years, say, and things have accelerated so dramatically. So let's say that trajectory continues. Where do we wind up?
Well, it can't, because if that trajectory does continue, we are moving into authoritarianism, and I don't use that word lightly, because the impulse behind a lot of this stuff is authoritarian. I'm not saying they want to put us all in gulags or all the rest of it. I'm not trying to catastrophize. But the truth is that if you believe that the only way to organize society is through the notion of group identity rather than individualism, if you believe that the only way to have a healthy society is to limit speech rights of its citizens, to curb the limits of the Overton window of what is acceptable to talk about, then you are an authoritarian, that you have that impulse in you.
Yes.
And so it is incumbent on everyone to resist it. And it's hard, because the key to the success of this movement has been that it couches its regressive ideas in progressive terminology. So it talks about things like anti-racism. Well, anti-racism to me means to be opposed to racism, which means I'm an anti-racist. They don't mean that. When they say anti-racism, they're talking about a rehabilitated form of racial thinking that sees people first and foremost by their skin colour and secondarily by the content of their character. You know, so it's the reversal of what we think it means. They use phrases like social justice. Well, that sounds great. Who wouldn't be for social justice? We think of social justice as equality, equal opportunity, equality before the law, you know, treating people well. They don't mean that. They mean an overemphasis on group identity at the expense of the individual. They mean a conviction that any inequality of outcome must be down to systemic injustice. They mean something very ideological. So it's hard to fight back against. You know, it's like a phrase like Black Lives Matter. You know, who would disagree with that sentiment? Of course Black Lives Matter.
Well, obviously.
But So it's a clever phrase because it means that it means that it's difficult to argue against the specifics of the movement. You know, a lot of people have reservations about Marxism, for instance. A lot of people have reservations about the goal to dismantle the nuclear family, which was on the Black Lives Matter website until relatively recently. So a lot of this, what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is a lot of this culture war is being waged linguistically, and that's why it's hard to stand up against. You know, if it were just about facts and truth, it would be easy, but because they reject facts and truth. So take unconscious bias, right? So a lot of businesses in the UK, a lot of corporations, schools are now introducing unconscious bias training. I think you have it over here as the implicit association test, which has come from Harvard, which an employer can use to sort of test your unconscious biases. Now, we all have a million unconscious biases because we're humans, but these tests have been proven in studies not to be effective. They just don't work. They just don't do anything. And yet we're still taking these tests. Because it sounds like a good thing. It's like, well, we want you to take these tests so that you're more inclusive, more diverse, and more open. But actually, they're just making matters worse. But you can't stand up and say, actually, I don't want to do this, because people will brand you a bigot. So that's the sort of trap that they set for you. Whereas more and more people have to sort of stand up and say, actually, I don't want to do this. And plus, let's just take the basic liberal position that your employer has no right to go probing through your head for your secret thoughts. I mean, that should be enough.
Well, we've completely given up on that. I mean,
yeah. But yeah, so it's hard. It's hard to stand up. But as to your question about where we will end up, I'm not, you know, I wish I was a prophet. I wish I was Nostradamus. I wish I knew where all this is going. But what I can say is, because the majority resist it, the majority are on the side of liberalism, old school liberalism. The majority of people are against authoritarianism. The majority of people see things, the way things are developing, with a sense of nervousness and trepidation. But they're also too scared to stand up, because largely intimidation is how it wins. You know, it only takes a few people in any given corporation or institutional business, a few woke, let's call them woke people, for the whole thing to collapse, because they're scary. They're like dangerous dogs. You know, you don't want to say anything because they will ruin you. They'll ruin your life. They'll post stuff about you online. They'll go to your employer. That's their tactic. It's the bullying tactic. So you need strength in numbers. Like, everyone's got to stand up and say, no, we're not doing this. You know, when Robin DiAngelo went into Coca-Cola to give a presentation, and the screenshots were there, they were leaked, where it said, try to be less white. That was the takeaway message, try to be less white. Well, everyone should have stood up and said, what the hell is this? We're not doing this. This is ridiculous. But they don't, because if you do that, someone's going to point at you and say, you're a racist. And of course you're not.
I'm a racist. So you're attacking someone on the basis of his skin color, and if that person resists, he's the racist.
Right.
Like, it's so insane.
Yeah, but that's because they redefined racism. Again, it's redefinitions of words. So racism now, as far as the activist is concerned, is a formulation. It's prejudice plus power. Actually, what racism means, and what racism is understood as meaning to everyone, is hatred or prejudice against people because of their race. Simple, right?
So you, I just want to play this clip. I think this is really, so obviously you're very gifted at seeing the structures beneath the words. Like, what's the point of this language? You see that clearly, and I bet that the years you spent in that library reading Renaissance poetry prepared you well for this. Here, it's interesting. This is a clip from November, I think, of this year, in which you explain what the transgender debate is actually about.
Okay.
Here it is.
It does come down to this idea of whether or not we should decide that gender identity or biological sex are the determining factors when it comes to sport. I think that's what this comes down to. Is it not a matter of identity? Insofar as Debbie is a trans person who you say you're biologically male, right? But a lot of trans people will say, but a trans woman is a woman. So is it just that we are all using different definitions here? There are people who are hateful towards people because they are women, and we can all agree that that's not acceptable. But what worries me is on either side, sometimes you hear the initial accusation is, this person must be a misogynist if they want people to be able to compete in sports on that footing, or this person must be a transphobe. I mean, Stonewall repeatedly, to me, keeps saying, as far as I'm aware, keeps suggesting that people must be transphobic if they are critical of their views. That's not a good starting point, is it?
No, it's not a good starting point. You have a very non-threatening way of explaining things, by the way, which is...
Oh, thank you.
probably has served you well. No, I think people can hear... I should take tips from you on that. People can hear what you're saying because you're clearly not animated by hostility or bigotry.
Right.
It's very obvious when you talk.
Well, it doesn't get us anywhere anyway.
No, it really doesn't. I agree. I mean, I admire the way that you communicate. I think it's effective.
But also we're all human beings, and most people are pretty decent, actually.
Yes, I agree with that.
We've got into these habits of thinking that anyone who disagrees must be
right.
Satan incarnate.
No, that's right.
That is a particularly difficult debate. That's the good thing about having my show on GB News is we are able to explore these things. A lot of the media outlets wouldn't have let me do that, by the way. But that particular debate, it is about misunderstanding of language. If you perceive the category of woman to be an identity, then it is fluid, and then it is something that can be changed. If you believe it is a biological reality, then you're talking about two different things here. So when a group says trans women are women, well, that sentiment is only coherent if you accept the premise that woman is an identity category, not a biological reality to do with the production of gametes.
That's right.
So, well then, can't each side say, look, we're talking about different things here, and then we can maybe move on further. But inevitably, the real risk of this stuff is that now, with the trans debate in particular, is that you have activists now denying biological reality and actually saying that it's not a thing, and that's not true. And you have to be able to say that's not true.
Oh, of course you do. You have to. It's not, if you don't live in a free society if you can't note.
Right.
Orwell famously said that 2 + 2 = 4. That's the essence.
When George Takei, who played Mr. Sulu, starts tweeting about how when you talk about biological sex, you're enabling hatred, you're enabling transphobia. And I just think, which I never thought I would have heard from Mr. Sulu. It's a weird world we live in.
Yes,
but that isn't helping the trans community anyway, because as Blair White has pointed out, if there's no such thing as biological sex, there's no such thing as being trans. It's actually quite important to acknowledge this stuff. And there is a world in which we could all, grapple with reality, but also accept that people identify in different ways. That could happen.
Sure. And it goes without saying that the original goal of all these liberation movements was acceptance, tolerance.
Right. Yeah.
But then it just speeds so far past that so quickly to a place where we have to, noting biological reality as bigotry. That's kind of as you just said. So, but why is that? Why do they always take it to the next level and then the 3 levels above that?
Well, it goes back to what you were saying earlier, because they're authoritarians. And not everyone within those communities are authoritarians. I'm talking about the people who are sort of leading the charge.
Right, of course.
This is why, and I know you've got a First Amendment here, which is great. We don't have that. We don't have free speech rights constitutionally protected in the way that you do. We don't even have a written constitution, of course. We have hate speech laws, which say that, for instance, if you post something online which is considered grossly offensive, you can be prosecuted for it.
And go to jail.
Yeah, it's happened. And people in the UK go to jail for jokes sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. There are 3,000 people arrested every year in the UK for things they've said that have caused offence online. That's happened. That's still happening. We have a police force that routinely investigates people for non-crime. That happens in the UK a lot. Within the period 2014 to 2019, there were over 120,000 recorded incidents of non-crime, what they call non-crime hate incidents, recorded by the police. So your name's in a book somewhere saying that you have committed a non-crime hate incident. In other words, someone has perceived something you've said to be motivated by prejudice towards their particular demographic, contacted the police, and it's been recorded. And the police in the UK, their justification for recording that is that the non-crime can precede actual crime. Well, all crime is preceded by non-crime. It's the nature of things, but it's a stupid idea. But it's there and it's happening. Now that should never happen. That's not a free society.
So UK doesn't have a written constitution, doesn't have a Bill of Rights, doesn't have a First Amendment, but it does have a 1,000-year tradition of free speech, which is how we wound up with our Bill of Rights. We stole all those ideas directly from the country from which we came.
Sure, but it's been jettisoned with remarkable rapidity.
When did that happen?
It's very recent. If I'd have said to someone 10 years ago, the police will be routinely investigating people for non-crime, everyone would have laughed at me on all sides of the political spectrum. It's happened really, really quickly. And therefore...
So if you're Boris Johnson...
Yeah.
Who I know a lot of people who know Boris Johnson who used to consider him impressive. I don't think anyone still does. But, this guy was a journalist for most of his life.
Yeah, he was a journalist,
Yeah. So why... Does he not notice this?
You would think. Okay, so I would have thought that with a Conservative Party in government in the UK, which is a right-leaning party in the UK, you would think that they would, who claim to want to conserve, that's what Conservative means, they want to conserve ideas. They don't really. I don't see any evidence of that. No one in government, no one in the opposition, no one anywhere is taking a stand in Parliament and saying, actually, shall we repeal these hate speech laws? At the moment there are two, really. There's the Communications Act of 2003, and the Public Order Act of 1986. And effectively those encode what we call hate speech laws. It's not called hate speech in the legislation, but that's effectively what it is, where people can be arrested for things that they say. We've had people in the UK arrested for misgendering. So someone calls someone a trans person online by a different pronoun. There was a woman who was arrested, put in a cell. She was arrested in front of her children. That happened. And that's what I mean about the authoritarian instinct. Because whereas, for instance, let's take the gay rights movement. The gay rights movement won out through a combination of protest, persuasion, and good faith. It didn't win out by saying, if you don't use the words that we want you to use, we'll lock you up. We'll go to the police. That's the big difference now. And that's where the authoritarianism comes in, is that now it's infected law enforcement and the judiciary. That's when it gets dangerous and scary. And that's where you could potentially be leading down a very dark path.
It seems like you're already well down a dark path. If thousands of people are being arrested every year for what they say,
I think from an American perspective, it sounds pretty bad.
Yeah,
right?
It's beyond comprehension, particularly for those of us who admire Great Britain and think of it as, really the cradle of the political rights that we enjoy.
And they get it wrong. When we talk about it in the UK, people say, yeah, but a lot of these people are nasty people saying nasty things. And I'm like, yeah.
Well, of course they are.
That's the price you pay for free speech. That's the price you pay for living in a free society. Some people are going to abuse that privilege.
There is a kind of, and Orwell wrote a lot about this, that on an island like yours, inevitably you have a kind of conformity attitude. There's a conformist impulse in people who live on islands. But
there's more than I thought. I mean, I've been a bit shaken actually by the way that people are more conformist than I had expected, and the way that people are just accepting this stuff, and there isn't really the pushback that you would expect from our society. So yeah, you're probably right.
Do you ever hear anybody say anything about it?
Oh yeah, I mean there are people. You've probably heard people, individual commentators making a fuss about this stuff, but it never seems to translate into actual action, and certainly nothing political. Nothing ever seems to happen, because I suppose the problem is if you are a member of parliament and you stand up and say I think we should repeal hate speech laws, the natural accusation will be, so clearly you're on the sides of the fascists and all the people who want to say these terrible things, because you're saying they should be allowed to say those things.
Do you have a lot of fascists in the UK?
Very few.
Is Mosley back? What?
Well, I mean, you wouldn't know it from hearing the way the activists speak online. Fascism is in terminal decline, has been for a long time. You could fill
80 years, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the number of actual neo-Nazis in the UK, you could probably get into a small potting shed. That's about it. They could have a little party, but no one's going to listen to them because they're not taken seriously. But if you listen to activists online, everything is fascist. Misgendering someone is fascist. Believing in the reality of biological sex is fascist. Believing in free speech. I've been called a fascist because I promote free speech, because, of course, free speech is what the fascists were all about, isn't it? That's right. Mussolini's March on Rome was a free speech rally, apparently. This is the historical illiteracy of these people. And the free speech argument to me is astonishing. That seems to be the most controversial thing now, particularly in the UK. I don't think it is so much here, but in the UK, yeah, it's.
We're moving fast in that direction.
Haven't you got some people who are agitating for the First Amendment to be amended, effectively, so it doesn't cover hate speech?
Of course.
Yeah. So it could happen here, even though it's codified. It could happen where you carve out an exception for hate. Hate speech shouldn't be constitutionally protected. And what you really mean is, speech you hate, things you don't like hearing. We'll make that illegal. We'll say that's, and that of course is massively historically contingent based on whoever is in power at the time.
It's insane.
It is insane.
It's foundational in this country that we have the freedom of speech. So I want to read. So you've written this new book, Free Speech and Why It Matters, which is, I would say, one of the coolest book jackets I've seen in a while. I want to put an excerpt on the screen here. Let me just find this. Oh yeah, here it goes. Free speech and why it matters. Free speech does not belong to anyone. It is a universal precept and a core human right. If it has come to be perceived as a specifically right-wing concern, this merely goes to show that those of other political persuasions have failed to uphold it. Great point. At any given historical moment, the defense of free speech is typically left to those who feel, justifiably or otherwise, that their opinions have become marginalized. So let's just go through this. It does not belong to anyone. It is a universal precept and a core human right.
Yes. I feel that the problem is that it's become too wedded to partisan political politics. So now people think, and they call it quite explicitly, the free speech debate is, quote, a right-wing talking point. Okay, so they'll talk about people.
They say that out loud?
Yeah, all the time. Yeah. In left-wing publications in the UK, almost every day. This is just something...
Who's the fascist?
Right, well, quite, exactly. And they'll point to, people on the right who defend free speech, people like yourself. They'll point to that and say, these are the people who support free speech, because I'm sure you've been demonized by quite a few people for your defense.
I don't go on the internet too much, but I mean, it's a little different as an American because, again, I'm 52, so maybe people who are younger don't feel this way, but the country I grew up in, was just not even questioned. That was our religion.
It is different. It is different. I think in the UK it is a slightly different thing. But yeah, they'll point out sort of right-wing people, Boris Johnson, all the major right-wing figures, and say they're always talking about free speech, so therefore it must be a right-wing thing. But of course, left-wing movements in the past have also. I mean, in fact, let's take the Berkeley movement.
Well, of course.
Let's take the new left, the early civil rights campaigns for black emancipation, for gay rights, for feminism. Right? And they all understood that free speech was at their core, but they were also deeply left-wing.
Absolutely. Well, the ACLU, which the American Civil Liberties Union, which in this country was the main defender of free speech.
Not anymore, yeah.
Not anymore. They're adamantly opposed to it, but that was a liberal group.
Right. So I suppose my point is that we have to get back to the idea that it's a universal value. I think at any given time. So you're saying in the US it's not considered a right-wing thing, the free speech debate?
Well, I mean, it's possible. That whole way of thinking is so grotesque to me that it's hard for me to acknowledge that it even exists, but
it's
so offensive.
Yeah, it does.
Because what does it tell you if someone is saying you don't have the right to say what you think out loud? What are they really saying?
What they're saying is you must conform to my worldview.
I'm your slave, is what they're saying.
Right.
Like, exactly, I can control.
Yeah, it's
your mouth. I mean, what?
I mean, it's absolutely incredible. So, I mean, the people who are arguing for hate speech laws, they're invariably from the left. But this is weird to me because when I was a kid, when I was growing up, all of the right-wing publications would be the ones saying, "Oh, this film should be banned," or this song should be banned, or whatever. That was always right-wing films. We had this with Train Spotting. Do you remember the film Train Spotting with Crash? There was a film by David Cronenberg called Crash. And there were right-wing papers in the UK tried to have it banned, or were saying we should ban this thing, and that was fairly standard stuff, But now it's coming from the left-wing publications like The Guardian, and they're the ones who are now saying certain words are harmful and therefore people need to be stopped from saying
The Guardian, if I just not to digress, but I just have to say, reads like your Twitter feed.
Yeah, it does. I know.
Is The Guardian for real, or is The Guardian like a very elaborate prank?
Do you think it's The Onion or something, the UK version of The Onion?
Well, it's hard to believe this is like adults write this.
It's hilarious because, for instance, The Guardian has published a number of articles supporting people who want to topple statues, saying that it doesn't matter that these things happened hundreds of years ago and these people were from a different time, we still need to hold them to account by today's standards. But The Guardian was founded by a person who made his fortune in the cotton trade. The Guardian, back in the day, supported the South in the Civil War. The Guardian,
of course,
criticised Abraham Lincoln for freeing the slaves. So by their own logic, we should burn every copy of The Guardian. But of course they're not calling for that. So the hypocrisy is hilarious.
Is The Guardian taken seriously in the UK?
Not by many. I mean, well, by people on the left. Yeah, but generally speaking, I mean, even a lot of my lefty friends now see it as too much. But
it's a very specific kind of left wing. It's not a traditional labor-oriented left wing.
No, it's not.
At all.
No.
I mean, it's very kind of affluent, academic.
Oh, I mean, The Guardian costs £2 a day. Working class people can't afford to read The Guardian, So it's very much a middle class publication for middle class people. The Guardian's very much kind of a Blairite. I mean, it calls itself left wing, but it's not in any authentic term. It's not in any. No. From what you understand of being on the left, it has no concern with class consciousness or social mobility.
Right.
Or any of
it's
those
not
issues.
like the Neil Kinnock paper.
No. This gets down to a fundamental point: is that identity politics has infected the left, and that's really what it is. Is that the left no longer means the left, as far as I'm concerned anymore. This is why there's all these strange alliances happening. You must have seen this where the people who traditional socialists even are aligning with people who are on the right, and because there's a shared belief in the importance of free speech, for instance, and there's a recognition that identity politics, seeing everything in terms of race, gender, and sexuality, seeing everything within those very narrow terms, at the expense of class. I mean, you saw it with Trump to a large extent, insofar as his appeal was largely with working class communities as well. So you get these odd alliances now, and of course, invariably, what that means is
Is that true in the UK too?
Yeah, very much so, and that's why Guardian readers and left-wing people generally they will demonise. Well, for a start, they demonise right-wing people anyway, rather than just saying that's someone who disagrees with my world. The assumption is that right-wing people must be evil, that they want poor people to die. They never take the more generous interpretation, which is these people have a different idea about how the world should be structured, and they think it might help everyone more if they structure it their way. You know, trickle down economics, that kind of thing. That might be, maybe it's not that they just hate poor people and hate the working class. So you've got that, and then in addition to that, you've got this identitarian thing which is happening, which has just completely alienated so many of the core left-wing voters of the past. This is why, you know, in the last election in the UK, the heartlands, the Labour heartlands, the left-wing heartlands of the north of England voted for the other side for the first time.
Well, of course.
Yeah, for the first time, yeah.
Well, you're seeing that here.
Yeah.
A lot.
There are parallels, aren't there? There are.
Though it does seem like free speech is the key. If you can't say what you think, well, it's very hard to change anything, right?
Absolutely. And we have to have that, and we have to fight for that. And if it gets to, well, there's one tactic that we could really push back against on this, which is that a lot of people are now using the word unsafe when they hear certain words. They say certain words make them unsafe. It happened this week at Cambridge University, at Wolfson College. A photographer had come to take a photograph of all the kids matriculating. And he, at one point, said to some of the boys, could you help the ladies down from that platform? And they complained and said that this created an unsafe environment because he had created they described it as targeted gender, a lack of gender inclusivity. I can't remember the exact phrase. But when you say something is unsafe, when you say words have made you unsafe, you are almost threatening your employer to do something about it. You know, if I go to my employer and say, oh, I disagreed with this person's opinion, they'll say, well, what's that got to do with me? If I go and say, this person's opinion has made this an unsafe place for me to work, they are obliged to do something about it, and it's a trick, and it's happening more and more and more.
I wonder, though, wouldn't it be healthier to say, you know, buzz off, you hysterical little narcissist? I mean, no, you're not unsafe. Stop whining.
Right, and if the employers just did that, this wouldn't be a problem. It wouldn't be a problem, but they capitulate every time. You know, it happens all the time. It happened to me. I was running a stand-up course at a theatre in London. I was doing it for a number of years. And it was just a weekend thing for young stand-ups, sort of between the ages of 20 and 25. And I was just helping them with the general craft of it, you know, giving feedback on comedy material, even things like mic technique, how to use the mic, simple, basic things like that. And then one year, one of the attendees complained about me to the theatre, saying that one of my jokes as Titania had made them feel unsafe in the room with me. And then that was ditched. I couldn't do it anymore after that.
Well, you couldn't teach anymore?
No. And that was in the early days of Titania, so that would have been about a year in early 2019, I think it was. So a joke that she had told meant I couldn't do that job anymore. And it was fine, actually, at that point, because I was doing it more at that point out of a sense of loyalty. I didn't need to do it particularly, and I enjoyed doing it. But they immediately said, well, you've created an unsafe space for the group.
How did you respond?
Well, I was a bit staggered because theatres are supposed to be for artistic freedom and creative freedom. And it was obviously untrue. That's the other thing about that. I mean, obviously, I'm not a threat. You can put me in a room with anyone. I'm not a threat. I mean, you could
I don't get a threatening vibe off you now.
You could take me. You know, it's like, I mean, I'm not a threatening person. But like, therefore, if you make that complaint, you know they're going to do something about it. And again, I'm talking about the British context. I don't know to what extent the safetyism. I know that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have written about safetyism in America and American colleges. So it is something that's happening here. You have safe spaces being created at universities all the time. So it is happening here. But yeah, it's now a really common technique. And I would just urge any employers, if one of your employees comes to you and says this person is maybe unsafe because of the words they use or the ideas they have, do what you said. Say, be off with you, narcissist. I'm not interested. That would be great.
Yeah, stop whining. But we have, and I don't know if this is true in the UK, but we have this sort of Soviet political overseer system called HR.
Oh, yeah. Same here. We have HR, yeah.
Yeah, so the point of HR is to take over the company completely. HR runs every company in which it's allowed to do what it wants, and they mandate conformity.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is it's the managerial classes, it's the administrative people. Actually, a lot of the problems in university, I mean, I know we've said there's problems with academics and the ideology within academia, but it's also the administrators that are causing a lot of the problem, making demands of students, you know. And this is why you get situations like at St Andrews University, say, recently in Scotland, new students were made to take a test about diversity and inclusion, which they had to pass before they were allowed to start the course. And the test would say things like, do you agree with the following statement? Do you agree that acknowledging your personal guilt is a good way to tackle your unconscious bias? And if they disagreed, they failed the test. Now that's sort of, that's one step towards compelled speech, isn't it? Because it's
well, that is compelled speech, flat out.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But that's come about because of the HR administrator side of things. That's the only reason that's sort of crept in. So yeah, that is a big problem.
And your view is, in the UK, most adults aren't aware of this or aren't willing to fight back against it or agree with it, or what do people think of this?
A bit of both. I think people, either they're not really aware, you only really become aware when it happens to you, I think. Yeah. So if you're lucky enough to be in an employment where you're not told to take these tests or do these sort of training, then it won't come to you. But I mean, for instance, if you're a teacher, you'll have confronted it. But think about it from most people's perspective. You're in your job, suddenly you're told to attend a seminar which trains you or teaches you that all white people are complicit in white supremacy and must feel guilty for it and must atone for it. And you feel like saying, I don't agree with that. But you know that if you stand up and say something, maybe next time you don't get that promotion, maybe next time you don't get the job that you want to get. Your card is marked. So isn't it much easier, for the sake of an easy life, just not to say something? Maybe you're an actor, and at the start of every rehearsal, people are asking you to declare your pronouns. But you don't believe in gender identity ideology, and to declare your pronouns is to express a fealty to this ideology.
Of course, that's the point.
That you don't believe. But then, on the other hand, you think, okay, but if I say, no, I'm not going to do that in a rehearsal, are you going to get cast again? The director's going to look at you and think, that's a troublemaker. I'm not going to put that person in my play again. So then you're sabotaging your own career by making a stand. And that's the power of this thing. That's why when I said earlier about how, we've just got to be braver, everyone has to do it. Everyone has to stand up, And there are signs that people are. Like, for instance, the Scottish civil service, the Scottish government recently instructed the members of the civil service encouraged them rather, to put their pronouns at the end of emails and to start meetings with their pronouns. And 60% of the Scottish civil service said, we have no intention of doing this. And they said, we're not going to do this. That's what it takes. And again, it's going to be difficult, because take the pronoun issue. People will say, we're just trying to be inclusive. This is a positive thing. We're just trying to be friendly and nice and make sure no one feels left out. And that puts you on the back foot, because then you think, well, I don't want to be the person that says that person shouldn't be included. I don't want to be that person. But really, it's a trick, because what it is doing is, as I say, is asking you to declare your faith in this political system.
But that doesn't even make sense. I mean, so I guess the idea of declaring your pronouns is so people will know what gender you identify with. Yeah. But isn't it obvious from looking at you or listening?
Of course.
Or if people are confused, you could explain it to them. Actually, I identify as this.
Right. Exactly. I mean, there are the trans people for all time have always found ways around this to negotiate this. I mean, we are very adept at identifying the biological sex of other human beings. We're very, very good at it. We have a very high accuracy rate on that. We don't need it. By declaring your pronouns, and of course the other thing, of course, no one uses your pronouns unless you're not in the room. I don't use your pronouns when I talk to you.
Exactly.
It's only when I leave and I talk about you. That wasn't. I'm not saying I'm going to do that, but you know what I mean. That wasn't a threat. But you end up. That's the thing. So it's pointless. It's pointless. It can only mean when you declare it. And when you ask others to declare it, you're saying, are you one of the team? Are you saying the right things? Are you using the right language? Are you one of us? It's a problem. And have you noticed? You say you're not on social media very much, but I tell you, the most abusive stuff that I get, if I ever go to that person's account, they always have pronouns there, and they always have the little rainbow flag, and all these symbols of, I'm virtuous, I'm a good person. And yet, they seem to have a correlation between that, and I'm not saying everyone, but there is some kind of correlation between the people who scream about how wonderful and good and compassionate they are. There's a correlation between that and how hateful they can be, and how vicious they can be. I mean, this is to come back to Titania. Titania declares her pronouns, flies the rainbow flag, talks about how wonderful she is. She'll often tweet things like, just to say, I really disapprove of genocide. I just want you to know that. And they say this stupid stuff because they want you to know how, but because, of course, if you are a natural bully...
But she's against genocide.
Yeah, she needs to... And she thinks she's really good for making that statement, because that's not her... Well, look at it this way. When people say anti-fascist in their bio...
Yeah.
Why do you have to tell me that? My assumption is that you are anti-fascist. My assumption will always be that you are anti-fascist, unless you start goose-stepping and, whatever. But, my assumption should always be that you are anti-fascist. Why? You don't have to... I'm suspicious of that. If I saw someone in a T-shirt saying, I am anti-fascist, I think, maybe not, because you're hiding something there,
Of course!
So there's something about this stuff. There's something about the correlation between signalling what a good person you are and actually being a good person. Because actually, good people don't need to scream about how good they are. They're just good.
Right.
So I find that's one of the things I wanted to send up through to Tanya as well, is that that she thinks she's so good, but she's vicious. If people cross her, she can be absolutely vile to them. Because they've carved out a section of humanity that are just, it's fine to Republicans, over here, or conservative supporters in the UK, it's fine to demonise those people because they're evil. They're evil. We've had protests in London with kill Tories and stuff like this. Just that's okay, and they can still call themselves on the side of the angels, and they can still say they've got basic humanity because they don't think those people are human, and that's hopeless.
How much time do you spend in the U.S.?
Not very much at all. So that's why perhaps my knowledge isn't coming across as
No. It's just interesting. No, because I'm always interested in the perceptions of people who don't live here but who are clearly insightful. Does the U.S. seem to be on a more aggressive path or less than England?
Some of the stuff seems quite scary. I think some of the explosion in the wake of the George Floyd death was frightening to see because you saw this sort of destabilization. And by the way, I'm supportive of all peaceful protest.
Well, of course.
When it, it's sort of fundamental, but when it turns violent like that, but it's not just that, it's when it turns violent and you have prominent politicians saying it's not violent. It's not violent when the city's on fire because it's for the right cause. But words are violence and microaggressions are violence, but that's not violence. What was it? Was it on CNN where they had the Chiron saying these are largely peaceful protests?
Yeah, and MSNBC had a stand-up. Yeah. One of its reporters literally described it as mostly peaceful as buildings were burning behind him.
Right. So this is where we get into the realms of this pseudo-reality that's being constructed, and we see it from the British perspective in the US as being a bit more pronounced. I think it feels like it's all a little bit more intense here because you have a very different history, and there is obviously you have the history of segregation and Jim Crow and all this sort of stuff that we don't have in the UK. So that's very much a specific. It's a very complex story.
Yes.
And this is how critical race theory emerged in the legal scholarship of the 70s to address in the specific context of that history. So now we're seeing all of that imported to the UK wholesale to a form in which it is incoherent. It is incoherent to apply critical race theory to a British context. It doesn't make sense. But we're seeing it into schools now. And the logical endpoint, of course, is segregation. You've had over here things like the Brentwood School in California, which segregated kids. Or was it they were segregated parents for an after-school consultation meeting?
There's a lot of that here.
And there's a lot of that going on.
Harvard University has segregated graduation ceremonies.
Right, which is clearly a massive step backwards. And then in the UK, we had it it was the American school in London, which is the highest paid private school in the UK, segregated children by race for after-school extracurricular activities. So it is being imported over here, but it doesn't make sense over in Britain. So what our worry, I think, is that the culture war might have started here, but we're importing it in quite a rapid way. And so we look at America, I think, a lot of the time, and think you're probably a few years ahead of us of where we're getting. I think that's the way we see it.
Man. Are you going to, while you're here, do a lot of events around this book?
Well, I'm only here for a few days, so I don't know if I can. Actually, because I haven't been able to, I wanted to come here earlier, but Biden was keeping everyone out for a long time. So now I'm allowed in.
Especially you, Andrew Doyle.
I think that's what it was all about, really. I'm going to say that. But then, no, I'm not doing much here, because the book's been out for a while in the UK. It's only just coming out now in America. But I've just finished a new book, which is called The New Puritans, which is about precisely the stuff we've been talking about, which I'm hoping will help people to understand what's going on. It's not out. It won't be out for another 8 months, I think. But that's something that I want to make it accessible. I think people are just, they can sense it's happening. They can feel the tremors under their feet. They can see that society's kind of falling apart in ways that they didn't anticipate and don't want. But they don't know quite how to tackle it or how to describe it.
Yes, that's right.
And so what I've done in that book is try to work through and explain where it comes from and where we take it from here. How do we even describe it? If you can't describe your enemy, you can't defeat them, right? We used to call it wokeness, because that's how they described it themselves. You remember Jack Dorsey appeared on the stage in a Stay Woke t-shirt. They always used to call themselves woke. But have you noticed over the past year, they say that woke is just a right-wing slur made up to attack us, right? They used to call themselves it.
Of course, that's where it came from.
But they just deny reality all the time. They deny the observable reality before everyone's eyes. We can Google it. We know they used to use that word, but now it's changed. And they will do this again and again. Whenever you find a way to describe them, they will destabilize the language with which you describe them so that you can't do it anymore. And they will keep changing definitions all the time. And so it's important to stay ahead of them at every step. It's hard, though. But that's why I keep writing about it.
I'm so glad that you left Oxford and your Renaissance poetry studies. Andrew Doyle, as I said at the outset, one of the smartest chroniclers of this moment and the funniest, and those are integrally related. We're grateful that you came.
Thank you very much for having me.
Amazing. Tucker Carlson is the name of the show. New episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday here on Fox Nation. We'll see you every weeknight, 8 p.m. on the Fox News Channel.